Hi, everybody. This is Zek, coach and manager of Team DUEL, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about Miramar's inclusion or lack thereof in competitive play for different tournaments like IEM, as well as leagues such as Auzom, and potential inclusion or not inclusion for PUBG Online and GLL. So ultimately, I'd like to showcase some different thoughts that I have about the map overall, some different elements that it actually brings to the overall game, and when it doesn't make sense to include an actual leagues and tournament play. Based upon some of my feelings of the actual map. So overall, let's go ahead and dive into it. So one of the things you'll notice about Miramar that everybody's made basically a point is the overall landmass. It's less of an actual impact on the game as a whole, is you just have more areas to actually know from a team perspective on how to actually play, basically looking at different regions of the map and actually studying it, and looking into those different things. Less of an overall impact. The terrain as a whole in Miramar is definitely, I would say, more whoopy. It has more kind of crevices, smaller areas where you have a small defilade where you can actually work into. A lot of kind of mountainous regions where it's up and down and very fluid-like into some sort of mountain, and overall peak that has a good vantage point of a particular area. And they're nestled around all different areas of the map. So that's kind of the overall terrain perspective of this. And there also is more emphasis on where the actual loot is kind of settled out. There are some different sparse areas, but taking into account different strategies, it is less likely a team can actually pull off kind of what we call like crap looting or shit looting, from a team perspective, and taking a look into those different things of being able to kind of hop from less priority compounds and grab loot while working your way into the actual circle. On Miramar, this is actually focused on basically larger city looting. So you're going to be in a kind of confined space with a set of players where the loot is kind of concentrated. And those are kind of like how the impacts the actual looting phases. So you're going to have potentially some more early fights where you're losing more people, but oftentimes that's not going to impact a lot of the early game, as the majority of teams are going to want to go ahead and basically get their loot and get out and not take any early game casualties. One of the bigger things, taking a look at this, is the actual road system. So one of the things about driving in Miramar, number one, vehicles are overall slower, anywhere between 20 to 40 kilometers an hour on average. I would say movement speed versus angle of how you're able to effectively control a vehicle. And basically taking those vehicles and getting to a different position is a lot slower than it is on Erangel as a whole. So that's one of the things to take into account. And the reason why, other than just the base kind of movement speed of vehicles, is the overall terrain management. So on Miramar as a whole, one of the things you actually have to do is take roads. Roads are far more valuable in different things than they are in Erangel as a whole. And this is because the way vehicles work, and basically the overall terrain is more forgiving on Erangel to basically vehicle path in certain ways that are less traveled by people. So roads become an actual hotspot, which is an overall strategy that you have to take into account, of knowing that more teams are going to be on roads because they are an actual travel hot zone. So it does bring up more strategies, like being able to contest transition areas, like heavily contested checkpoints, such as over here east of Hacienda, as well as areas kind of like outside Picado, which is a major road junction. So it does bring into different things like that, but it also does bring in the element of less options of how you actually want to travel, which can be kind of troublesome when it comes to this game overall. So this kind of brings us into the RNG element. So the main RNG kind of component that has the largest impact on the game is actually how circles are popping from one to another. And this is basically going to influence the major decisions that are to be made for overall player movement as a whole, and basically understanding what a team has to do in order to get into zone versus what a team doesn't have to do, or the adversity that they don't have to go through in order to basically progress into a zone. So this is kind of the dilemma that Miramar as a whole brings up. So with fewer kind of rotational options, you basically can get into a point in the late game where the circle doesn't go in your favor. You kind of have two options. Number one, you take a road option, and it's likely to be heavily contested by multiple teams. Or B, you also take a option where you can go on foot. You have more flexibility, but you also lose the advantage of having your vehicles going into late game. Although less effective, but providing different things like cover, small transitions that can be made late game, and taking a look at those two things, both of them as an IGL, taking like the overall decision making process that goes into it is kind of a loss situation. So going down a road that's going to be heavily contested, there's a large chance that you're actually going to be losing a team. There's a larger chance someone's going to be potentially playing the strategy of knocking out transition teams and then moving into the zone later. So driving into basically an ambush on some sort of road where you don't really have too many options is going to be something that's going to be happening more frequently. And if you're not favored by the zone, that's going to ultimately get you killed versus teams that don't have to drive through that. The second option of footing it, ultimately you're going to have to take potentially 1 to 2 fights in most cases based upon density of teams in the circle. Even though Miramar provides more terrain coverage, you're ultimately going to be taking those fights just as a result of wanting to secure a position. And if you're in the zone, you oftentimes don't have to face that. You're in a position that's already fortified. You like your overall position there. And basically taking a look at those two options of what a team outside that pop zone has to face versus a team inside the zone that was favored to them has to face, is far more than it should be from basically on a game to game perspective. Now, looking at this in a long term scale, basically, or a multi game series, this can be counteracted because as you play more games, each team is going to have a stabled out, basically, spectrum of where they were favored as a whole versus where they were not favored. So you can have more games initially on that favor you, but overall, in the statistical standpoint, you're also going to have those later games in a series of 20 games where the first 5 favor you. You're going to have 5 somewhere on the other end of the 15 that are also probably not going to favor you, just based upon the overall RNG aspect of that and statistics. And this works for this map in basically making it viable for long-term leagues. So different things like Auzom, where it's a multi-month, happens every weekend where there's multiple games. It does make sense for that perspective to play this. I definitely think it should, because it does bring in different elements and a different meta of how you actually can play this map. The issue is with a shorter game, or a shorter series of games that basically take a look into this actual map. One of the issues you run into is basically having one game's results have a larger impact on your overall team's kind of or performance, what they're able to actually do. And And why this is actually an issue on Miramar versus Erangel more so is by that nature of options you have in order to basically take a favorable position when the circle doesn't go in your favor. So with Erangel, you're given, I would say, 10 times, if that, more options and basically how to maneuver to a favored location in the next circle, or get even at the very most get into the next circle that does make sense from your team, versus Miramar, where you're either taking, like I said, that heavily contested road, or having to foot into a situation where there's one good decent location on the edge that you're going to be wanting to get into, and that's why it's overall problem for short-term games. So taking a look at that and what that overall means is, I believe that Miramar should be played on those long series or long-term leagues that are multiple months. But in a short-term series or tournament, it doesn't make much sense because of these elements. And some people argue that, oh yeah, it's great to see fighting and something like that, but when you have a game based more heavily placed on that first turn placement and not overall impact on the actual game, so having potentially one of the fixes to this would be figuring out a way of basically having a point modifier system where Miramar has in an overall system either a different series of points that you gathered on that actual map, so versus Erangel, just based upon its RNG, or you can have basically a point modifier. So you're still using the same point system, but maybe because Miramar has a basic larger element of RNG given to it based upon how it is actually structured, you can take a look at building something like a 0.95 x modifier into the actual points received. Obviously, that's kind of thrown out there. It could be something like you receive 60% of the points you normally would for the basis of that game. Would have normally played out with overall positioning and kills on Erangel, but that would be the end result for something like on Miramar. So I feel like those are two ways of handling the actual overall RNG that is actually brought into the actual game through playing on a map like Miramar. And hopefully taking a look at these, we can, as a community, figure out what actually makes sense from a competitive perspective and making Miramar able to be agreed upon to be played. Because I really think it's a really good map and should be played from a competitive perspective. We just need to figure out how to balance it in regards to the RNG elements, as well as time played on the actual map in regards to number of games and the point system awarded for that, or even just in-game settings to make it more viable from a team's perspective, in order to favor people who less favor people who are given the circle. So taking all these things, let me know if you guys have the same feedback, any different ideas, any new ideas of basically how to include this as part of the actual map pool and what actually makes sense, or even any counter arguments. I'd be happy to hear about it and start a conversation. Going to you out from Duel, Zick. Later.